Hello, hello. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and welcome to In Time. With me today is Xandering, and joining us today also, first time in a little while, is Homozygoat. Homozygoat, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Hunkered down, trying to stay safe. So the usual business. So status quo for me.
Yeah, well, it it feels like a lifetime ago that wasn't the status quo for most of us. Dear Lord. So, apologies for being a little late. It's in time, not on time. A few technical issues.
How it
We
goes.
got, yeah, we got it sorted out. So, all right. Well, we've been covering Ukraine a lot because that's a really big deal, and we have been covering Mar-a-Lago a lot because that's a really big deal. But I think in all the big deals that are going on, people haven't been talking about or thinking about COVID. People are going around without masks and more than they have in quite some time. And I've been seeing in the news a lot of talk about a new resurgence of COVID that they're expecting to come to the U.S. Is that true?
I think that's a pretty big understatement if we're talking about a COVID resurgence. There's kind of two parallel situations going on with COVID. In terms of a resurgence, really what's driving a lot of cases right now is immunity wearing off. That's right now at face value the biggest driver of cases both in Europe and in the northeast of the United States. There's sort of another, I think, perhaps more insidious issue lurking beneath the surface that is going to make itself pretty apparent in the upcoming winter months, and that is a proverbial variant soup of too many variants that the variant watchers are having a difficult time actually keeping track of these days. So there's kind of a twofold, a 1-2 punch, so to speak, right? We're getting hit right now with the waning immunity fist, and the new variant fist is going to follow up that one in about a month or two. So broadly speaking, that's the situation right now.
Is it true that only about 5% of Americans have gotten the latest booster?
Yeah, so the uptake of the new bivalent boosters, unfortunately, remarkably low, and there are a lot of reasons why. I think a fair amount of them are political, but right now, in terms of the eligible population, we're looking at somewhere between 5 and 6%, and that is nowhere near enough to confer upon anybody the sufficient amount of protection to truly stave off the incoming wave of new variants to the best of our ability. So looking pretty rough for the winter coming up.
I'm gonna put on my climate change hat. How can you predict the climate? It's in the future. And I'm going to ask you, well, gee, how do we know that there's, going to be we heard a lot of talk about it, but how do people know that, or what makes them think that it's very likely that there's going to be a wave here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, that's an entirely fair question. More or less, we can say this pretty definitively because we have, when I say we, I mean the scientific community, they've managed to really ascertain out of the variant soup, out of these dozens and dozens of new variants of Omicron, they found a handful that seem to have acquired the right set of mutations that allow the new variants to evade immunity that people have gotten from vaccines and that people have gotten from all the previous Omicron infections to date. These things have been tested in laboratories and tested with antibodies from people who have received vaccines, and that seems to be the case. The newer variants pretty effectively evade all prior immunity, which underscores the necessity for people to try and get that bivalent booster, which has been updated to try and better match the mutations in the contemporaneous current variant soup. So there's pretty solid experimental evidence to show that the variants coming up in the winter are pretty good at evading prior immunity. And all sorts of projections are kind of converging on that same premise.
Is it just experimental, or are we seeing anywhere in the world where already they're getting hit hard by new variants?
So this is kind of It's a really big question mark. I mean, we're seeing new variants. You'll probably see the alphabet soup thrown around in the news. The variants in question that you'll probably hear about, they're called BQ.1, BQ.1.1, XBB, BF.7, and then I think BA.4.6, among a couple of others. Those are the ones that you'll see thrown around in news articles and hear about on your local news, or maybe even the national news if they care enough. Um, in certain countries, certain variants from that list have started to achieve dominance. Singapore is actually a country that just had a wave solely due to XBB. Their wave has already subsided, but that's because they have a 90% vaccination rate and an 80% booster rate. So that actually, I think, speaks to the effectiveness of vaccines and boosters, right? If the vaccination rates are that high, they were able to implement things like mask wearing, distancing, ventilation improvements, and they were able to just stave off the wave pretty effectively. They're already on the downswing. They saw very little death. Their hospitals were full, but the amount of death was minimized because they are a highly vaccinated country. Germany has they're on the downswing of a waning immunity wave. BQ.1 was only, I think, at the peak of that, maybe 20% of all cases in Germany. So it hadn't achieved complete dominance at that point in time. However, what was very curious, and this is a trend that we saw in Germany, a trend that we saw in France, and a trend that we're seeing in New York, specifically, New York City, is that we're seeing either increases in cases or the case counts, the official ones, remain steady, but we're seeing pretty stark increases in hospitalizations. So what we've really not figured out yet is, okay, maybe if these new variants are 20, 30% of all cases, does that mean the new variants are more severe and we're feeling the effects of those already? Or is this more a function of people's immunity wearing off, and now because of that, they're getting the current dominant variant, not one of the new ones, and their cases are more severe just because maybe they haven't gotten a vaccine in a long time, something like that. So there's still a lot of work to be done to try and parse that. A lot of the work that would help to do that would be to figure out what variants the hospitalized patients actually have. So that way we can see, okay, if all the hospitalized people have the new one, then we can say, okay, we have to really start looking after whether or not these new ones are actually more severe. And if we're seeing a trend where they keep getting more and more severe with every iteration, or if they have all the old ones, we can just say, okay, their immunity is worn off. It's probably been a while since they had vaccines. They might have some underlying medical conditions that aren't doing them any favors either. So we can continue to try and increase the amount of bivalent boosters given out and encourage people ideally to wear masks and clean the air whenever possible. We haven't figured that out yet, and there is going to be a lot of work to try and parse what's going on. But certainly, with enough time, the new variants are going to become dominant in the U.S. because the Northeast is already seeing them. And the West Coast has just seen them detected for the first time. So they're going to be working their way into dominance probably by Thanksgiving.
We all remember, and In Time was covering basically every single night when COVID first hit. Italy in particular was just decimated. And it was a epic nightmare. But if I understand correctly, Germany now has more people in hospital beds than at any other time in the pandemic, including the initial hit. Is that accurate?
Are you referring to Italy specifically?
No, Germany.
Germany. Okay, sorry, I misheard. Germany.
I mentioned Italy, but I was trying to be poetic, and I'm like, mixing states and all this. I've mentioned Italy, but I was asking about Germany.
So I think this goes back to what I DM'd you when you reached out to me about a little over a week ago. At the apex of Germany's waning immunity wave, they did set all-time hospitalization records and ICU bed occupancy records. And their ICUs are still very, very, very occupied, but the trend seems like it's going to go down in agreement with the case counts. We have to remember that ICU occupancy, hospitalization, and death, those are lagging indicators. So it usually takes 2 to 3 weeks after cases go up to see changes that agree with the official case counts in hospitalizations and death. So Germany's case count is now on the way down, and we kind of have to allow a little bit of time for that to be reflected in hospitalizations, ICU occupancy, and death. So it seems like it's going to trend that way, but it's concerning that even without a new variant achieving complete dominance, Germany reached an all-time pandemic hospitalization record. I think that really suggests that Western countries are not really built sustainably to handle COVID as time goes on, right? We have gone in the other direction of COVID safety with time, like you alluded to at the very start, right? Very few people were wearing masks. We didn't really address clean air infrastructure at all, and we're reaping the benefits of what we sown, unfortunately. It's just, the reaping is grim reaping, because we're just going to let people get COVID and just continue to get picked off with every time immunity wanes or every time we get a new variant. So I think it's an omen that if Germany managed to set records without a new variant, making its presence entirely felt, then they really need to hunker down for when a new one comes in that is immune evasive and gets all the people that the waning immunity surge didn't.
Well, a lot of people say that, the natural tendency of viruses is that they get more infectious but less lethal over time. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so that's a big myth. Viruses really don't self-attenuate. They don't become more mild with time. Really, the virus cares a lot about transmissibility and evading immunity. Not to anthropomorphize it. It's not a sentient being. We could a separate discussion as to whether or not they're even alive. But when we look at evolution in terms of what the virus does, in terms of the tricks that it plays and the mutations that wind up being present, that's the outcome, is increased transmissibility and immune evasion. The question of whether or not a virus kills somebody is an entirely separate question that is decoupled from whether it spreads or not, right? The virus doesn't give a shit whether it kills you or not. You're just a host for it to spread to somebody else. So somebody who gets it could spread it to 10 people, 5 people, and live, or spread it to 10 people, 5 people, and die. It makes no difference because they spread it to a bunch of other people.
So it's already succeeded by that point, and it's ostensibly its primary purpose, which is to spread. Yeah,
exactly. Germs live to make more of themselves. They're survivors. That's kind of their goal, whether it's a bacterium, a virus, a fungi. They live to live and live to reproduce. And in a way, that's kind of what we're hardwired to do too. We're the only sentient creature on the planet. So, we have awareness of all of this, but they're just kind of following their programming, so to speak. So there's nothing in their programming that amounts to a kill my host button that they decide whether or not they want to press it. That they just do what they want to do, and we are the unwilling passengers just going along for the ride.
There was, I also read that we still haven't gotten much better at detecting what the actual COVID numbers are, that when people die, we're still not necessarily testing for COVID. The patient has died, and unless it was a presumptive COVID beforehand, if I recall, then, we're not necessary. So we're still having a hard time figuring out accurately how many people are getting infected with COVID, which variants, and what they're whether or not they've died of it, or whether it was something else. How big a problem is that?
Yeah, so right now, kind of like I alluded to, right, where we saw this trend in a couple of countries, Germany, France, and now in New York. This is what raised the question about whether or not the new variants are intrinsically more severe in terms of killing people. Is that the case counts were flat or increasing by a smaller magnitude than how much they're actually increasing? And that suggests that we are massively undercounting cases. That's going to be a big problem when we look at how we test. There's very few rapid tests that are going to be included in official case counts, right? There's no channel to where when somebody gets a positive rapid test, the information gets magically transmitted to the state, and the officials know about it. The person themselves taking the test has to, if you're an American, you have to go to rapidtestresult.org and then input information yourself. So they more or less outsourced reporting positive rapid tests to the individual. And that's a political issue because they absolutely have resources to try and actually count cases more so than they are now. PCR tests, which they're the more complicated lab test that has a turnaround time of like a day, those are run by testing laboratories, and they have a way to report those results to public health officials. So what you kind of see is that like people who can afford PCR tests, those are cases that are going to get reported. But anybody who tests positive on a rapid test, 99% of them probably aren't reporting those to public health officials. So that's why we now have this like decoupling of case counts and hospitalizations and death, because the testing is not being reported accurately. Then on top of that, the amount of tests, whether it's a PCR or a rapid, and whether or not they get reported or not, people are not testing to the degree that they should to accurately capture how much COVID is actually going around in a particular community. The helpful metric is wastewater, where you can have scientists and public health officials, they literally go into the sewers and collect poop water to actually see how much virus is in a set amount of poop water, and they can extrapolate to say, okay, there's a ton of virus in your community. We went into the sewer, we found a ton of the virus in the wastewater, because when people get COVID, they can poop out the virus. I think it's 30 to 60% of people, big range, but enough people poop it out for that to be a pretty good metric. So an example of this, you could go to the website. I think it's Biobot. Biobot.data or biobot.io. I'm forgetting the actual URL, but if you Google Biobot, they give you a big graph of case counts versus wastewater, and you can see all the way up until the big Omicron surge at the start of the year, those two lines were like overlapping. You could see wastewater was like a perfect degree of representation of how much COVID there was in the community. But since we started using rapid tests, those lines have now separated. The wastewater line is now a lot higher than the official case counts, and that's how it's going to be indefinitely. So that, I think, is a very easy to understand sign that there's still a lot of COVID going around, and official case counts are not the trustworthy metric they should have been. And we're unfortunately, I think, becoming more reliant on private indicators of how much COVID there is. Biobot, that's a private company. The Walgreens test positivity metric, that's a private company. Obviously, it's a pharmacy, but they report those statistics online in terms of how many COVID tests that they administer at their pharmacies come back positive. So that's another indicator, and the positivity rate's at least 25%. So 1 out of every 4 tests is positive. So that's a lot. It's 5 times more than the WHO recommendation to, lift restrictions on masking, distancing, and whatnot. The WHO recommends 5%, so we're at least 5 times that. Interestingly enough, if you really want to get into the memes, the Yankee Candle Index, where you go on to like Amazon and you look at the reviews for Yankee candles, when you start seeing an influx of people complaining that the candles have lost their smell, that's when you know there's a COVID surge, because COVID, in some cases, takes out people's loss of smell. And scientists have actually looked at Amazon reviews, and they've done at least one study on it, and it's a surprisingly accurate indicator. It's wild that it actually works, but it's sad that we have to turn to Amazon reviews for Yankee candles to detect a COVID surge.
It is. I love things like that. You can tell approximately how many people died by how much ice cream was sold on any given day. There's a whole bunch of interesting corollary relationships. Like I love that stuff. Manic Pandas, and we were trying to get unfortunately I knocked out the thing, so I can't get the text up for live chat. But Manic Pandas, I wonder what the hazard pay is for collecting pandemic-ridden shit water. I was thinking about that. I feel bad, some guy in high school is just like, I want to become a scientist. I want to save lives. His buddy goes on Wall Street, probably ripping people off or whatever. They're not all crooks, but having said that, I lived through 2008. That's, at any rate, one of their buddies is making millions on Wall Street. And what's he doing? Going through the septic systems, trying to collect poop for science, which is saving lives, but it doesn't pay well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's emblematic of scientists really not getting paid as much as they should. But yeah, literally, people are being paid to just go down into the plumbing and just cut open a pipe and literally. I actually have a YouTube video in terms of how they do it exactly. But they basically just stick a giant fancy tampon into the wastewater pipe and squeeze out the water in the laboratory.
Whoa.
That's literally what it boils down to.
Okay, I didn't need to know that. So it's just wow. I have two more questions, and I want to kick it off to Xandering. One is going to be a reason. Well, they're both going to be a little political. Speaking of,
Go for it.
I heard that for the first time. So when you take a look at a chart of COVID cases, you can see a huge disparity in the U.S. between minorities and whites. They gave a lot of reasons for those disparities, like an order of magnitude at least. One of them being access to information, access to testing, and access to health care if you got sick. But the death rates for minorities were about 10 times, at least when this first started. Very quickly started to even out, but for the first time at least according to the Washington Post, for the first time in the pandemic's history in the U.S., whites, have a higher death rate in COVID than any minority. Any explanation for that? Do we know why that is?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of reasons that underlie this. The first, I think, would be some degree of success with vaccine outreach to underserved people. So essentially, LGBTQ people, and if we're talking specifically on racial grounds, non-white people. So to some degree, it's a sign that like vaccines have gotten into the arms of minorities after enough time. And if we're using the death rate of white people as the standard, the normalization, we've now seen, relative to white people, the death rates for minorities dip below that. So to some degree, that's a contributing factor. I think it's also important to recognize survivorship bias. We are looking at the death rate at a snapshot in time. So if we're looking at it, in recent months and saying, oh, white people are now dying at a higher rate, that might suggest that, okay, maybe a lot of minorities, because of lack of access to healthcare, lack of outreach, distrust in America's history of medical racism, all of those things probably combined and actually resulted in disproportionate amounts of death in minorities. So it may very well be that, simply put, a lot of minorities have already died from COVID, and now we're just starting to watch the more privileged whites who have greater access to the healthcare system and vaccines now starting to get picked off at a higher rate, simply because maybe they're not keeping up with vaccines, maybe they have medical conditions that underlie it. Without digging too deep, we're kind of agnostic as to why whites are now dying at a higher rate. But it's important to remember we did let a lot of minority people die, and in terms of the political reasoning why that is, I don't want to necessarily say that's by design, but it's something that America has done in many other circumstances throughout its history. We've been content to allow things to disproportionately affect minorities for many, many years and not do too much about it. And then when white people start getting affected, then there's now suddenly more concern than there was before. I don't think that latter part's really going to manifest here for COVID because of broader political considerations. But I think the last point I want to make on this particular issue is that you're going to see a lot of people in relation to that statistic that you provided. They're going to say, oh, hey, we now have health equity. White people are dying more. Let's keep doing what we're doing. And that is not the answer to anything. People of all colors should be dying as little as possible. We should be vaccinating as much as we can, masking, distancing, and implementing clean air infrastructure, cleaning the air, filtering air, and ventilating rooms. So, there's still a ton of work that needs to be done, both on the individual level and on the societal level. So this is not an indicator to be like, awesome, cool, white people are dying, let's just continue the status quo. I think anybody dying, regardless of race, is a bad thing. We just have to acknowledge that for most of COVID, it's been minorities who have been disproportionately impacted by long COVID cases, and COVID death. Now that the tide is shifting, not a good sign regardless, but it's, I think, largely because of that survivorship bias.
All right. And then last question. China had a zero COVID policy, and it looks like it's going to have two. Right now, there's still some arguments, at least to the best of my understanding, as to what's going to happen. First of all, it appears like they're losing control of it, and it looks like some of the new Omicron variants may be more contagious, and that they'll finally lose it. But since they actually don't have a particularly good vaccine, and they don't have any natural immunity because nobody's gotten it, it may all be for naught. What do you think is going to happen in China? And is this an indicator that maybe, complete lockdowns was never a practical or a good idea?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. What I will say is that China's policy has generally been one of zero tolerance. They're not going around and executing every person that tests positive. That would be a true zero COVID policy where you're just taking out people left and right. There's just not CCP hit squads coming for COVID positive people.
Don't give them the idea.
That only happens when you're a billionaire in China. That's when the hit squads come for you. COVID positivity, they'll let you live. So. Generally speaking, what they do is what I would describe as a hard and fast targeted lockdown. So I think you've probably seen in the Omicron era, you've probably seen a couple of lockdowns in like Shanghai, for example, when they see chains of transmission established, they lock down the entire province. I think this goes a little too far where they actually weld people shut in their apartments or in their homes and like they physically cannot leave. That I think is excessive, especially because they weren't giving those people enough food to survive on while they were forcibly locked in their apartment.
Jesus.
But
wow.
I think broadly speaking, with improvements to make their approach more human friendly in that respect, I think generally speaking they've been on the right track. And you alluded to one of the reasons why. The vaccines that they made within their borders, those were live attenuated vaccines, I think, either live attenuated or just inactivated virus particles, and they were not great. I mean, even in the pre-variant era of COVID, we're talking maybe 50% efficacy against death. So their vaccines were really not that good. And of course, I think probably due to political reasons, they weren't willing to purchase anything from Pfizer and Moderna to actually get vaccines that have greater efficacy within their borders into the arms of their populace. So that creates a reliance on the non-pharmaceutical intervention path: mask wearing, distancing, increasing testing, and cleaning the air, as well as trying to develop new vaccines. One of the things that they have done, which is something I wish we would have done, that goes back to the testing issue we were talking about earlier. On street corners everywhere in China, they have testing booths. Like, think of like a mall kiosk or like a food truck. Imagine if you just had one of those that ran PCR tests, and you could go, any street corner you wanted to go get a PCR test for COVID, you could do that. Any street corner you were on, if you had a passing desire to get a COVID test, there would be a booth right there for you. They actually created that infrastructure to try and keep track of where the virus is and how much of it there might be. So when you combine all of their non-pharmaceutical interventions along with their hard and fast targeted lockdowns, even as dysfunctional as those hard and fast targeted lockdowns can be, they're still in a much better position than we are in terms of how much they've been able to live and do things like, music festivals, concerts, go to the gym, basic everyday activities. They've been more able to do in a much more sustainable fashion, right? They're approaching this with a game theory perspective. Every new variant, every COVID infection, they're playing for a win or playing for a draw, and they'll try to do whatever they can to survive and give themselves more opportunities and buy time for something like vaccine development. There was a headline yesterday that actually started making the rounds that they have now officially approved a new technology of vaccine, an inhaled vaccine, which is the technology that we in the West absolutely need to develop if we are to sustainably deal with COVID. Whether or not it works, I think, is a different story. They had maybe one preprint that got released on it, and the data was pretty questionable. So I have a feeling they might, as they continue to vaccinate their populace with this brand new vaccine, this inhaled vaccine mist. It's basically like an inhaled Johnson & Johnson, so to speak. If the data that was released is reflective of reality, they might go back to some hard and fast targeted lockdowns and kind of reevaluate their strategy from there in terms of vaccine development. But China's playing the long game, right? They know from SARS in 2003 that if you let a coronavirus spread rampant, the people who survive are going to be wrought with disability, and you're trashing your workforce. So you're not going to have a workforce to compete in the global economy to become the number one world economic power, to supplant the United States as that particular global hegemonic power. So that's the game that China's playing. They're playing a very long game where they want to preserve the integrity of their workforce, and in doing so, that's obviously going to positively impact the health of their populace. They're going to do so by any means necessary, and that's where they can drift into the unacceptable territory by starving people to death by locking them inside. But broadly speaking, they're willing to accept that because statistically, they're playing a numbers game. The amount of people who suffer that way is going to be drastically fewer than if they were to let COVID run rampant. Now, the question really at the core is, are they going to be able to do this forever? Are they going to lose control? Is one of these new variants going to pierce the veil? Of course, a variant's going to pierce that veil. They're going to see infections, of course. The question is, what do they do in response? If they continue the hard and fast targeted lockdowns, I think they're going to be in a much better position than we will. And I think eventually, whether it's a vaccine they develop in their borders or a vaccine developed elsewhere, and China decides to not let political desires guide them, nationalistic political desires particularly. And if they buy a vaccine from elsewhere that really truly reduces transmission for years, then that's when they'll truly let go of their grasp. But not a moment before then, not before they have an actual indication, whether it's their homebrew vaccine or a vaccine from elsewhere, that stops transmission of the virus for much longer than mRNA-based vaccines do. And that's kind of what I advocate for from the West. That's the threshold that we need to get to, is developing a new technology of vaccines called mucosal vaccines that give us a different kind of immunity that gives us that benefit, where we have immunity that lasts at least a year in terms of preventing infection, and we can actually truly go back to something that closely resembles normal. But we are behind China, I would absolutely say. I know India is also approving a vaccine of a similar type. So we want to talk about, is this just a quirk of China? No, this is something that other countries are also striving towards. And we are very much behind in that. And that's why China is doing what it's doing, to buy time for this vaccine development to happen. So broadly speaking, I think they're on the right track. They go overboard a fair amount of the time, but it's for reasons that I think make sense.
All right. Xandering, any thoughts?
I'm a pretty vapid person. Just ask anyone in the live chat. I'm not sure how many thoughts actually rattle around in my head.
I don't think anybody. I'm going to interrupt you. There's nobody in the live chat that thinks no thoughts go through your head. They think your head is filled with thoughts. It's just a lot of them disagree with a lot of those thoughts. That's all.
Oh, I have the wrong thoughts.
You have the wrong, exactly. Well, you're a conservative. You're, I was going to say Republican, but I won't insult you that far. But anyways,
yeah, please don't.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah, regale us.
I'm personally waiting for the BFF variant because everybody needs a BFF. So I think we'll solve all our problems once we get the BFF status with COVID. So how do you propose going about in a kind of in the Western world at least, especially in the United States, with a kind of COVID weary population, the political opposition to COVID policies? How do you go about convincing that we need to have yet more COVID policies?
Yeah, so I think this is a realization that the individual is going to need to have, is that both parties are running in the opposite direction from COVID safety. I think the Republican Party would run at a faster pace, but the Democratic Party is absolutely running in the wrong direction. I think that's exemplified by Biden's CDC director running around maskless 1 month after getting the bivalent booster, and then she just got COVID like 4 days ago. So, she is the exemplar of what not to do, and an exemplar of how the Biden administration's approach has been a complete and utter failure. They've been telling people, as long as you're up to date on your vaccines, you don't need to do anything else and you're good. Really, this just goes back to what we were doing at the very start, right? Vaccines by themselves are good. They'll keep you alive, but they won't prevent you from getting sick if your immunity has worn off. So we can recognize that the vaccines are doing a good job of continuing to protect us from bad outcomes, but they are not fully sterilizing. You can still get sick even if you're vaccinated. So what we need to actually do is communicate that to people. People need to understand just because you have a vaccine doesn't mean you're safe. Just because you have had 5 vaccines still doesn't mean you're safe, right? There are more things you must do besides getting vaccines. Absolutely, you should stay up to date on your vaccines, but you got to do more than that. So really, it goes back to the tried and true, right? Wearing a high quality mask, N95 or an equivalent mask, that's very easy to do. And ideally, for people who can afford it, something that's very easy to purchase. I understand that, people are not in the best financial situations a lot of the time, but nowadays, at least what I always recommend to people, you can go buy a 20 pack of masks for like $20 to $30, depending on whether or not there's a sale. So these things are surprisingly affordable, but still, not everybody can purchase one, which is why ideally I would like the government to give everybody a mask for free. There was a plan to do that back in the Trump era, but Trump himself just put the kibosh on that. So that kind of knocked mask wearing out of the public consciousness. It left it up to very confusing communications from the likes of Fauci and Walensky once Biden took power. So for people to just get on board with anything, it has to be free and has to be easy to do. Getting a vaccine, for now, still free, still very easy to do for a lot of people. Rural areas have issues, and we need to do more to actually help people living in rural areas get vaccinated. Absolutely. Mask wearing, again, ideally, that should be done in all public spaces. What is going to be the true challenge, and I think what is going to make the biggest difference, is the notion of cleaning the air, right? Back in yesteryear, epidemiologist John Snow found cholera in the Broad Street water pump and gave everybody the idea back in the 1800s that, hey, there's germs in the water. There's something in the water that's making you sick. Maybe we should clean the water so we don't drink dirty water. We need to have that same coming to Jesus moment with the air, right? There are things in the air that can make you sick. We should invest in things that can clean the air. So that way you inhale clean air and you don't get sick. So on the individual level, I always recommend Corsi Rosenthal box. It's a device invented by the Dean of Engineering at UC Davis. It's essentially a cube. You take a bunch of HEPA filters and a box fan. You tape them together in a cube. I can send along instructions if you really need to get the lowdown. But it's essentially a homemade industrial HEPA filter. And in many cases, it actually outperforms industrial HEPA filters. I made one myself when my roommate got COVID back in April, and it helped prevent me from actually getting sick in the first place. But there is that idea that if you clean the air, you'll reduce the risk. We need to implement cleaning the air in public spaces. And that's going to be the biggest challenge, especially when we're talking about getting the government involved, because a lot of these interventions need the government involved to actually achieve it, right? To take public spaces, whether it's a restaurant, somebody's workplace, a gym, a bar, a restaurant, getting them to spend the money to clean the air is something you're either going to have to do for them, you're going to have to give them the money to do it, or you're just going to have to force them to do it with punitive measures on the back end if they don't. That's something that's going to be very difficult to achieve, but the White House has at least expressed some interest in doing it because they had a clean air summit a little while ago. I'm not going to get into the details of that because some of those details are kind of infuriating because they're kind of slow walking it and being misleading about it, but that's a separate discussion. Really what I tell the individual is, look, if you want to be free, if you want to go do whatever the hell you want, the price of that freedom is eternal vigilance, and you always have to be COVID safe in everything you do. You want to go to a Halloween party, you need to make it COVID safe, right? Put a Corsi Rosenthal box in there, put a HEPA filter in there, open the windows, test everybody before you go into the Halloween party. Like, there are tools that you can use to do that. Like you said, Asandering, people are COVID weary, and it's difficult to get them to care. But interestingly enough, people start to care when they keep getting it over and over and over again. And the idea is to prevent that from happening, right? You can essentially get reinfected every 6 months if your luck is bad enough, assuming you do nothing to mitigate your own risk, assuming you don't get your vaccinations, don't wear a mask, don't clean the air. So there are things that people can do, and a fair amount of it is affordable, and people can take the initiative into their own hands. It's now just a question of the government's kick the can to the individual as far as public health is concerned. how many individuals are actually going to, rise to the occasion and keep themselves, their friends and family, especially the vulnerable ones, safe. And I think more and more people are going to come around on that as we get into yet another winter, where the White House is currently projecting another 180,000 deaths this winter in a worst case scenario. So we're in for a ride if people do not act.
Do you have any ideas for how to convince politically opposed people that don't believe the media anymore about anything related to COVID? I have met tons of them. I've seen tons of them posting online about all of this. Do you have any ideas how you can possibly reach those people? It seems like the CDC has lost an enormous amount of credibility with quite a lot of people. How do they get that back?
Yeah, well, so it's kind of an interesting question that you bring up, because I think the CDC, the leadership, I'll qualify that and say the leadership, the people running the CDC and the Biden admin applying political pressure to the CDC to sort of tell people, COVID's not a thing, it's done, we beat it for midterms. The CDC is really not all that interested in doing much about it anymore. I think people on the individual level have to realize that, like, despite what the media may or may not say, I don't think anybody likes being sick. Whether it's COVID, whether it's the flu, whether it's anything, whether it's just a cold, like, do people enjoy being sick? Like, there should be some degree of self-respect for your own health, right? Even if COVID's fake, let's pretend a lot of these politically opposed people are like outright COVID deniers and they think the virus doesn't exist, or something crazy like that. There's still a bunch of other germs right now circulating, right? We have seasonal flu, we have RSV, regular colds. There's still the solutions that I advocate for apply to other germs too, right? Getting your vaccines for seasonal flu and RSV vaccines certainly in the works. Cleaning the air helps all of the germs floating around in the air not get into your lungs instead. Wearing a mask, again, helps you do that as well. So, at this point, you can have the discussion about long COVID and whether or not they're going to be able to go to work, do the things that they want to do, truly enjoy freedom, right? If they want to be free, then this is the price of freedom, right? A lot of those types will say all the time, freedom isn't free, and I would agree with that. It's just the price that we all collectively have to pay in order to give each other a collective degree of freedom. So if they want to be free and they want themselves and their friends to be able to do whatever they want to do without COVID throwing a monkey wrench into all of it and rendering them not able-bodied, yeah, this is the path. This is the way to reduce the odds of that happening to you. I really hope people have a vested interest in healthy and being healthy and not being sick. At the end of the day, I get that people are weary of COVID, but regardless, nobody enjoys being sick. Nobody goes and licks toilet seats for the singular purpose of getting sick. I think it's kind of a weird political position to be pro sickness.
Wait, no, rewind. What did you just say? They don't.
It feels like it sometimes. I think that was the thing in the earlier times of COVID. I know a couple of social media influencers actually looked at toilet seat or two and put it online just for the meme, but it's not a thing that's very common, thankfully. But yeah, it's just difficult to get people to have some self-respect and value their own health. We're not used to thinking about it in America with our healthcare system that really doesn't get you thinking about your own health until it's far too late and you're already stricken with a million different issues. But it kind of starts a conversation in the right direction when you're trying to get people to think like, hey, do you enjoy being healthy? Like, do you want to go do the stuff that you want to do? Do you want to be able to work your job to provide for yourself and your family? Like, this is the way you continue to do that.
So what would you say to some of the people? It's like, look, if you're worried about COVID, then you go do your COVID things that you want to do, and stop trying to push your COVID things on me, because I'm perfectly fine. I've assessed the risk. I'm not particularly at risk, and stop bugging me with your shit. It's on you if you're worried about this virus to take the appropriate precautions to protect yourself. I'm doing what I feel is appropriate to protect myself. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, so that's the you do you argument. You can do whatever you want. You can wear your mask, get your vaccines. I'm good where I'm at. Well, unfortunately, viruses don't respect interpersonal boundaries. That person could do them and they could wind up preventing somebody else from doing their own thing too, right? the ethical discussion that was had at the very beginning of COVID, especially with respect to vaccine mandates. But we're not even talking about that, right? We're just trying to convince somebody who just wants to live their life and be COVID agnostic in everything that they do. So at that point, you more or less just have to say, well, look, okay, you being COVID agnostic, that's going to prevent me or somebody else who might be really at risk from doing whatever they want to do. You might kill somebody. Can you live with that? Do you want to live with the possibility that you're hurting people you care about by giving them a COVID infection? Even if they live, even if they don't get long COVID, right? It's still unpleasant for the time you have it. You know, you don't want to get anybody sick. It's a very weird position to take, to be pro spreading disease. And we've unfortunately normalized that in the pre-COVID times with everything else, right? The seasonal flu, colds, you know, people go to work sick all the time. There needs to be a cultural change in this country where people have more concern about whether or not they are sick and whether or not they give other people sickness, you know, whatever germs they have, they should keep to themselves. So masks are a good way to do that.
That's going to happen? Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think we're going to have that shift? Because I certainly don't see that shift now.
Yeah, it's not. I think it's going to take more than COVID to manifest that, which is, I think, a frightening omen. It's going to take something perhaps more severe in terms of a death outcome to actually manifest that. Right now, there's a big Ebola outbreak in Uganda, and we'll see if any of that makes it stateside again with its 50+% fatality rate. But climate change is going to accelerate a lot of germs and their spread. We're going to get a lot of the hemorrhagic fevers in terms of a mosquito-borne illness, dengue, chikungunya. Like, we're going to get a lot of germs we're not used to seeing very often. And, you know, people start bleeding out of their eyes. I think that's going to be a pretty big wake-up call for some folks.
I kind of always pointed out that, you know, once we started getting into the pandemic, it was like, we got kind of the worst of all possible viruses to hit us. Granted, it showed us how lacking we are in actual pandemic response, but it was like it was serious enough that it caused serious problems and should have been taken seriously. But it wasn't serious enough to cause the population to stand up and go, "Oh crap, we need to take this seriously." You know, some people did, a lot of people didn't. You know, and in the United States, we seemed to like split the baby right down the middle with our policy, and we got the worst of everything. You know, so I'm hoping maybe I don't have much hope, I should say. But I'll cross my fingers that we actually learn something, and that, you know, our government will become proficient at least maybe one thing, and be able to get some policies in place for mitigation. And I think we have a very large uphill struggle convincing people, you know, especially on the COVID front, because, you know, people are very COVID weary. And they're kind of tired of all this stuff. They're like, "Can't we just be done now? That's it. I'm finished." I know several people that are just like, "Look, I'm done. It's like a cold. I'm moving on with my life. COVID isn't a thing anymore. I don't care." And
right.
even they know people have gotten sick. They've had it, and they're just like, "You know what? Life goes on. It's like we cannot keep stopping everything, you know, because of this stupid COVID thing. It's here. You're just going to have to deal with it, like we do with everything else." You know, and if you want to get vaccinated, go get vaccinated. If you want to wear a mask, you know, you do you type thing. And so I think we're going to have a pretty big struggle, at least in terms of COVID, unless it gets significantly more deadly, or, you know, maybe we get something else that is more deadly. Unfortunately, I think that's what's going to take to really shift the minds. But I'm really kind of hoping that maybe we can come up with a better approach, maybe better information. You know, though people have become so entrenched, you know, often politically when it comes to COVID itself, that I'm not sure. I don't have much hope that we're going to be able to resolve it around COVID. Am I being overly pessimistic or not?
I mean, I think there's most of what you say is right. You know, I think I was having a discussion.
Wait! Whoa! Back that up a step. We're talking Xandering here, right?
I was just about to say, eat it.
Well, I mean, look, I think like if we're being realistic, I think Xandering's right when we're talking about, you know, what it's going to take to actually manifest that cultural shift. I'm not sure we're going to necessarily see it come as a consequence of COVID. I think it's going to take COVID plus something else to truly actually hammer that into people's minds. But by that same token, that's not reason to stop beating the COVID precaution war drum. I was having a conversation of a very similar nature with a bigger Twitch streamer by the name of Carter. He basically had, because at the time when I talked to him, I was going through and seeing how much of a super spreader event TwitchCon was. So I was just like quote tweeting people's pictures that they posted on Twitter saying like, okay, you got COVID at TwitchCon. You were running around without a mask. Like, what did you expect to happen? Like, people who were begging for sympathy or outright saying like, yeah, I went to TwitchCon knowing I had COVID. I don't care. It was worth the memories.
Oh
like
my
a lot of
God.
those people were posting on Twitter. So I had to, quote tweet them and basically say, oh, what are you doing? Like, this is not sustainable. This is like your third or fourth COVID infection, depending on the person. Like, do you really just not give a shit anymore about yourself or other people? Like, why do you dislike other people this much? And there's actually data to kind of support that. I think the underestimate says 40% of Americans lie about their vaccination status or how many COVID precautions they're taking at a given time, or their COVID status, whether they have it or not. It's a smaller sample size, like less than 1,000 on a self-reported survey, but that probably means the actual number's higher because of reporting bias. But besides the point, I was having a conversation with this Twitch streamer about that, and he echoed a lot of what you said, Sandra, that, the toothpaste is out of the tube. People are just, they're COVID weary. They're going to keep doing whatever they want and trying to, live their lives as humans do. And even if they're not perfect in terms of their COVID safety, they're just going to do what they're going to do. And there's not much you can do to actually stop them. And to some degree, yeah, you yourself cannot, slap a mask and a vaccine into the arms of every single person, but we now have to really be the changes in the circles that we run in that we want to see. Like, we have to keep our communities COVID safe and COVID conscious as a starting point and try to sort of disseminate that attitude that way. Like, the more people who are going back to mask wearing, who are communicating on their social media, like, hey, I just got my bivalent booster, here's the side effects that I'm feeling about, the more we kind of return COVID safety into the discourse and into the public consciousness, the more people who are going to be rendered aware of it again, who might then realize, oh shit, it's not actually over. Oh wait, there's more variants. Wait, what? People are dying again? What the fuck's going on? Like, the more people continue to get exposed to conversation about it, and the more people get exposed to the virus itself, you're going to see people come back into the fold in terms of wanting to take things seriously again. I was actually just talking about this in a Discord earlier before hopping on tonight. Somebody's coworker showed up maskless with COVID and was just hacking all over the place. And so I said, like, okay, test yourself in the next couple of days and be on the lookout for any symptoms. And they're kind of giving me this take of like, well, I already had COVID once, so I'm not worried about it anymore. And I had to say, well, getting COVID multiple times is not a good thing. Like, the outcomes of reinfections are worse across the board. Every single infection that you get on top of your first one increases the odds of long COVID and every bad outcome that could kill you or render you living with a disability. Reinfections are bad. Every expert agrees reinfections are bad. And they said, well, it's not some big, scary, looming disease anymore. Well, no, you're vaccinated, but that doesn't mean it's not going to impact you at all. It's going to impact you if you get it. And the more often you get it, the greater the odds it's going to impact you. So, the virus doesn't care whether you check out. The virus doesn't care whether or not you want to be free, you want to live your life like COVID is not a big deal. The virus doesn't give a shit. So, the virus won't sleep. The virus won't rest. Why are you?
So, Professor Zygo, as my kind of last thing, you're grading our country as a whole, government, individuals, state governments, our country as a whole. If you were the professor of the CDC and you were going to grade our country on our pandemic response, what grade would you give us?
I would say in the pre-vaccine, which is essentially the Trump era, I would say C-. I would say in the Biden era with vaccines, I'd say C+. So not that much of an improvement, but both of those grades leave a lot to be desired. I will absolutely say. I think I can pretty conclusively say the Biden era has been better just in terms of vaccination rates, but their over reliance on the vaccination button as the only thing that they want to do is now coming back to restore the Trump era disease burden that we would have hoped the vaccines would have eliminated. The vaccines are an imperfect tool, which is why we need better ones. But again, their over reliance on vaccines. They don't talk about masks. They barely talk about cleaning the air in the Biden CDC. So I would say it's average at best, and we're vaccinating people, which is a good thing. That's why you get the plus on the C. But I think the reason why I would give the Trump administration such a high grade at a C minus would be because they at least got Operation Warp Speed 1 up and running and got the vaccines, the Moderna vaccine and then Johnson & Johnson really developed through Operation Warp Speed. Pfizer did their own thing separate from Operation Warp Speed. So at the very least, we would have had Pfizer, but the more vaccines, the better in that kind of situation. But they at least knew that you needed vaccines of some sort. So they get credit for that where credit's due. But they didn't really help anyone or do any favors by not testing as much as they should have. They squashed the free mask plan. Trump getting COVID and making a mockery of it while he had to be flown to Walter Reed. Like, all of that was tangibly harmful. And then the CDC director in his era being a lab leaker, that also did not help either. So
Trump's pulse ox.
We've made some improvement.
Trump's pulse ox dropped to below 84. We don't know what it was, but we know it was below 84, and his doctors were doing their best to not lie, but to not tell anybody what was actually going on. And the few leaks we've had since then confirm what we already know. He was a lot sicker than he gave credit for. If he hadn't have gone to Walter Reed, if he hadn't been president of the United States and gotten a hell of a lot of extra attention because of that, I think whether or not he'd have made it would be severely in doubt.
Yeah, if he was the average American, he might have died at home.
Well, so let me do two quick things. First of all, Homozygoat has a Discord. We're going to drop a link to that Discord right now. We'll also have it in the description. Sorry, I was behind today, so it wasn't in there. But we'll make sure it gets in there, and we'll drop that in the live chat. I gotta tell you, oh dear Lord. That is a Discord that I go to, and like 90% of the conversations are so far over my head. So it's a bunch of guys who, yeah.
You're gonna scare all of us, conservatives off. Don't tell us it's over our head. Tell them it was very engaging and very informative, and you really should get in there because you're getting some good science going on. And if you want a good trustable source, that you're going to bypass all this political BS, get Biden out of the way, let's see what the actual statistics and numbers are, then this is where you need to go. Because all of that is true.
That's the second part, and that is equally true. So it's a whole bunch of nerds who've forgotten more about this than I will ever know, and I'm reasonably well educated. But having said that, they will stop and explain anything to you. It's an educational Discord, so if you go in there and you say, I'm confused by words like, bivariant XY LMNOP, words like the whatever, they'll explain it to you. So it's you guys are great about making it approachable. So when you show up there, you're just going to see a whole bunch of stuff. You know what? Start a conversation. People there are great, and it's an amazing resource. So we'll get that one out. There it is. Thank you, Titan. So that was my first comment. And my last one, and I'd forgotten to mention this earlier, but I think you brought this up, and we've talked about people who've gotten it before, and we've learned that there are micro scars that occur in a number of people who have COVID. These scars occur on the lungs, and in some cases they're detectable. You can tell you've got them from the first infection, and in some cases you can't, and in some cases they're indetectable. But some cases occur time and time and time again, and by the fourth and fifth infection, you can tell something is wrong, and it's permanent. It can't be fixed. So how often does that happen, and could you tell us a little bit about long-haul COVID and what we do know about the symptoms that persist?
Yeah, so that's essentially a pretty big umbrella in terms of like what is long COVID all about. What you kind of allude to in terms of every infection causing some amount of damage to the body. Uh, I was kind of joking about this earlier in a different Twitch stream, but you know, at the end of the day, even if you have a quote unquote mild infection, mild is simply a definition that you didn't need to go to the hospital. It wasn't that bad that you needed to be hospitalized. Doesn't mean it was pleasant, and it doesn't mean that you don't have any, subclinical damage in your body kind of lurking, right? You might not have any symptoms, you might feel back to normal, but you never know what damage the virus might have done to your body. And getting infected and reinfected repeatedly, that's not going to do you any favors. That's going to essentially increase the odds of cumulative damage, sort of pushing you over a threshold which is not particularly clear into being a long hauler if you don't outright die from a repeated infection. So, generally speaking, if we're looking at the underestimate, sort of the lower bound in terms of how many people have long COVID or permanent damage that they know about because of a COVID infection, you can take the current death toll and take that number and say that's the very low estimate with a very strict definition of who has long COVID and who doesn't. But in recent times, I think, especially since we last spoke, there have been a couple of advances in terms of what are called biomarkers, or essentially a very easy to measure biological parameter from like a blood test that you could use to classify people as a long hauler or not. Akiko Iwasaki, who is a researcher at Yale, she's the, I think, premier long COVID scientist right now. She was one of the people who essentially arrived at that conclusion that there's a biomarker they can measure a hormone level called cortisol, and pretty much every long hauler that they ever took samples from in their studies had an abnormal level of this hormone cortisol in their blood. So that's a pretty like low-hanging fruit in terms of actually formally testing people. We're not there yet where we can actually like formally test everybody. I wish this would be integrated pretty quick.
That's a stress hormone, right? So yeah, I mean, anybody under a significant amount of stress will test positive in that sense. Is that accurate?
I mean, possibly. I think what they were sort of implying is that there's an actual dysfunction between the brain, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. So they're essentially saying COVID actually dysregulates a specific hormone system, part of the larger endocrine system, and that's how it manifests is low cortisol levels. But there's certainly other manifestations too. There's a lot of blood clotting abnormalities that happen in people who survive COVID infections. I just read a Twitter thread earlier today about a gentleman, I think maybe in his late 30s, early 40s, who got a mild case of COVID 4 months ago and now just had a blood clot in their leg that spread into their lungs, and they had to be hospitalized for 2 days to get the blood clots out of their lungs before they killed that person. Jesus. So
I want to sound really, really smart right now and mention that that's called a pulmonary embolism.
Yes, a pulmonary embolism. You got it. No, it's actually important that people kind of understand, deep vein thrombosis or DVT. That person in question had a blood clot start in their leg and their calf, and then it went into their lungs and caused a pulmonary embolism. But it's good that people get familiar with those terms because it makes them more aware if something like this happens to them after a COVID infection, or even outside of COVID. You can still get blood clots if you're on a long plane flight, you sit too long, stuff like that. But besides the point,
it's a really big concern with like truck drivers because we sit for 90% of our days.
Exactly. Yeah, you're more aware than the average person because of that. So it's good that you have that knowledge in tow. There are all sorts of different manifestations of long COVID. That researcher that I mentioned, Akiko Iwasaki, they kind of categorized a lot of long haulers into 4 groups. There's the autoimmune issues group where those people have autoimmune disease. There's the blood clotting group where they have issues with blood clotting and stuff as a consequence of abnormal blood clotting. There's the virus persistence group where the virus is actually able to survive in their body at very low levels and continue to replicate and piss off basically the immune system constantly. So that's very much a thing. And then there's just kind of like a fourth, like, we can't categorize you into one of these 3 groups, so you're just sort of the everybody else group that have a variety of different things going on with them. But to address the broader point that you brought up, Nick, there are definite manifestations that are pretty clear by now, and it is absolutely true that getting infected over and over and over again increases your odds that you might again tip the scales in favor of you now having long COVID and not being able to go to work or do the things that you want to do. I think in that non-specific group, brain fog was one of the most common, manifestations of long COVID. It's been compared pretty accurately on the molecular level to what's called chemo brain. Now, if you've ever known anybody who's had to take chemotherapy, they can't think straight. It's really hard for them to just kind of stay focused and concentrated and do things because they're taking chemo. COVID generates the same kind of inflammation in the body, and it recreates things pretty similarly on the molecular level in the brain. So people who get long COVID and they get the brain fog, they're going to have a really difficult time concentrating, focusing, doing any sort of mental tasks, anything that requires a lot of like executive decision making with your brain. So if we want to kind of use those as the four categories, blood clotting, autoimmune disease, virus persistence, and brain fog plus other, that's kind of how it's manifesting in less broad terms so far. In terms of how many people are actually truly suffering from this, some other self-reported questionnaires have clocked in the number a lot higher than what I had said earlier in terms of, take the death toll number and say that's how many people have it. The actual number, I think, is probably at least I want to say at least 4 million. I think there was an actual Brookings Institute survey that went out to people, and they used that data to estimate at least 4.2, 4.3 million people in America have long COVID. But, the less we do about it, the more that number is going to rise. And that is ultimately, I think, what's going to make our current trajectory entirely unsustainable as we're now trashing our workforce. And any issues we have with, why is nobody working anymore? People don't want to take shitty jobs. Well, now a lot of people are leaving their very good high-powered jobs because they get brain fog and they can't focus anymore, or they have blood clotting issues and, now they have a hard time breathing, so they can't do what they were doing before. Rinse and repeat towards every manifestation, and there's somebody out there who has suffered in that respect. And ultimately, unfortunately, vaccination, it reduces the odds, but not by much, right? Even if you're vaccinated, up to date on your vaccines, there's still about a 10% chance to get long COVID with a mild infection that didn't require hospitalization. So, vaccines are not the way out. They are the cornerstone of the response, but they're not the only thing, because again, vaccines, they don't prevent long COVID 100%, but they help reduce the odds, just not as much as we need them to. So yeah, long COVID is still very much an omnipresent thing, and I think a lot more people have it than they realize, and we're only going to figure that out as time goes on and more people continue to get sick, more people start talking to each other and then comparing symptoms, comparing what they're dealing with, and then ultimately come to the conclusion of oh shit, I probably have had it too, and I've probably had it for a long time. There's a lot of stuff that people go through they don't realize qualifies them as a long hauler.
Well, actually, Sandy brings up a great question, and so I want to hit it because it's really important. If I recall, actually, the original stats, and they may have changed, but originally 50% of people who had COVID actually showed no symptoms whatsoever. Sandy pointed out, Sandy said, quote, "I've never had any classic symptoms, and we've been jabbed and boosted. Is there any way to know if we have actually had COVID and suffered only minor symptoms? So if you're curious, if you haven't had any symptoms, or if you think you can't tell between a cold and COVID, but you are concerned about whether or not you could suffer long-term effects, so you'd like to know if you've ever had it, is there any way to know?"
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a worthwhile question to ask because there are actually a fair amount of long haulers who never knew they had COVID. Right, there are people who have long COVID because of an asymptomatic case, which is a wild thought, and I think a fair amount of them came from the pre-vaccine era to kind of qualify that. But all that to say, yes, in terms of the actual science, there is a test that you can get. It's a blood draw. What they will be looking for is a specific type of antibody against a protein that you would only ever encounter in the event of a viral infection. It's called an anti-nucleocapsid antibody test, or an an antibody test for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. That's actually what rapid tests actually look for, is the nucleocapsid protein, or the N protein itself, from the virus, which is why they're a pretty good indicator of how contagious you may or may not be, because it's only looking for a protein that requires actual live virus in your system for it to test positive. So you can actually look with a blood test to see if your immune system made antibodies against that protein. That is the test that will distinguish whether you've been exposed and whether you actually were able to fend it off and therefore had no symptoms. Or if that test comes back negative, then you've truly never had it. And if there was a particular event in question, then it was probably some other germ, or it was such an infinitely small exposure that you never made antibodies to it, and other parts of your immune system fought it off. That's also a very real possibility. But that gets into more technically oriented speculation, and that's probably not what we're really getting at with the question. So the problem with that test is that you have to go to a doctor to get it. This isn't something that you can just like go to Amazon and order. You actually have to go to a doctor's office and get a blood draw, or go to a testing laboratory and get a blood draw for them to actually run the test, because it's a test that requires trained personnel to actually carry out. So based on that, if the person asking the question, if they have halfway decent insurance, then yeah, they could probably go to a doctor, and the doctor might be able to justify it, so that way the insurance pays for it. Or if the price is actually within somebody's budget, just for the sake of like they really, really want to know, then they might be able to pay out-of-pocket cash pay to get the test done. But it'd probably be a decent chunk of change in the hundreds of dollars if they're that intent and insurance won't pay for it. So I really wish there were tests that were actually made to address that question, that were more accessible than the test that I just described. Something kind of like a rapid test, but would look for those specific antibodies in a sample that people could provide. I don't know if you would necessarily find them in like spit or like a throat swab or a nasal swab. So that's probably why it has to be the fancy test with a blood draw.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you, Sandy, for your question. That was an excellent question. So is Andrew, any final thoughts before we go?
I hope we don't run into another virus that actually changes our mind. I hope we can change our minds and get a little bit more aware of infectious disease control without that. But I don't have much hope that will happen.
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment. Unfortunately, I think there are some candidates for viruses that could make us a lot more concerned about that floating around in the world right now. I mean, it's always worth reminding folks that we're one unlucky mutation away from 1918 flu coming back. Bird flu is currently rampant right now. If you were on social media at all in the last couple of weeks, especially Twitter, you might have seen allegedly an emu farmer hugging her emu that was sick with bird flu, which everyone was screaming, "What are you doing? Why are you hugging a sick bird? You could be patient zero for bird flu. What's happening?" So turns out the bird didn't actually have bird flu, and it was just stressed because all of the other birds on the farm had bird flu and had to be killed. So thankfully that emu story had a happy ending. But we're one freak clown event like that away from something else that could be more fatal than COVID, for making its presence very much known. So I think this is kind of a clarion call that we really need to take whatever we can into our own hands to do our best, even if the government's given up. That doesn't mean we should.
Well, it's been a delight having you here as always, and very informative. Is there anything else that you thought we should know, or in case there's something I didn't hit that you feel we should discuss before we go? Other than is Andring being right? I'm inconsolable. I just don't. Nothing makes sense to me anymore.
I mean, look, I think Asandering is a pretty good representation of just like how weary people are of COVID. I'm, as much as I like this from an academic perspective, academically it's pretty interesting. But at the end of the day, I have immunocompromised family. I would like to be able to safely get on a plane and fly to visit them for the first time since COVID started. So I'm also just incredibly weary and tired. But I know that the way out is to continue being as vigilant as I have been, and encourage other people to do the same. That's really what's going to create the change that we need. But it's worthwhile to note when when a Sandering communicates that sentiment, it's a very common sentiment right now, even among the quote unquote Democrats, that people who identify as political Democrats. They say the same thing. So I think this is kind of a sentiment that really transcends a political party right now. It's just very ubiquitous. People are tired of it and they don't want to focus on it for the sake of personal convenience. And I think if you want to have your cake and eat it too, that means you got to be COVID safe. So in terms of, I think, anything we really haven't covered, I would really encourage everybody to go get the new bivalent booster. Some data on that came out yesterday. Little bit disappointing. We were kind of expecting a little bit more, but I think there are some technical aspects we could tweak with it. Worst case scenario, it's just as good as the previous vaccine that was monovalent, the ones that we've gotten before. So, at the end of the day, ideally, we need to be vaccinating ourselves once every 6 months. So this bivalent booster, worst case scenario, it's going to be just as good as the original vaccine, which has been doing a surprisingly good job, all things considered, in keeping people alive. So I think it's also important to recognize the current vaccines that we have are really good still. And the bivalent one, you can only go up from there. Worst case scenario, it's just as good as the previous one. There are some technical aspects we could tweak with that, but that's an entirely separate discussion. So get up to date on that bivalent booster if you have not already. I'm sure there's ample supply depending on where in the country you live, so you might be able to schedule an appointment pretty readily or find a state-run walk-in clinic like I did to get yours. It's also worth reminding folks, again, high quality masking is what is needed. So a cloth mask or a surgical mask doesn't cut it these days. You need an N95, a KN95, a KF94, or if you're a European resident, an FFP2/3 tier mask. Those are the masks that we absolutely need to be wearing in public as much as possible. Again, final reminder too, we have to be conscious about the air. I always joke and tell people, you're raw dogging everybody's air. We have condoms for sex. You don't necessarily want to raw dog people when you have sex with them. So why do you want to raw dog their air? A mask is a good way to protect yourself from what's in the air, but also you can clean the air too. So that's why we need to start conversations about, okay, the spaces that I go to work in, the spaces that I hang out in with other people, are they COVID safe? Do they have good ventilation? Are there air filters? Could I make a Corsi Rosenthal box and maybe put them in my workplace, in my friend's apartment where I go hang out for this Halloween party, something like that. We have to be conscious of these things and start discussions about them. So I kind of put that into all of your minds, that start thinking about the cleanliness of the air in the places that you go and the measures that you can take to try and make that air cleaner for you and everybody around you. So with that being said, I'll just go ahead and plug my stuff. I think Titan was generous enough to link my Discord. You already plugged that. So I will say I am actually currently streaming on YouTube right now, because Twitch as a platform might be shooting itself in the foot. So Titan might be able to link my YouTube channel in your guys' chat for anybody who isn't subscribed. I'm taking a fair amount of, I shouldn't say a fair amount, whatever Twitch content I can get edited by some folks and posting those videos to YouTube, starting with some shorts, and then going to start putting more of the longer form segments on YouTube for people to watch. So I'm slowly starting to migrate some content to YouTube. So my Twitch is twitch.tv/homozygoat, spelled exactly like you see it on the screen. My Twitter is essentially that with an underscore at the end. So those are the platforms that I'm on. I'm kind of making this gradual, I shouldn't say transition quite yet. If Twitch crumbles because they mismanage the platform, then I will, transition everything to YouTube. But I'm starting to establish a presence now on this side of things. So I think it's just worthwhile to mention that. And as always, thank you so much for having me. It's always a good discussion when I get to talk to you and the Sandering. Very much appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and the other In Time folks.
Well, thank you. We love having you on, and we will make sure that gets in the description. I'll also say, aside from highly recommending that you go check out his content, if you ever need any help with YouTube, hit me up. I've been on the platform for a while, so but believe me, nobody can screw this platform up better than me. Just let me know. Just give me a shot, and I'll show you how it's done. Anyways, I'm a fan, so hit me up. I'd be happy to help you out. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Isandering, for joining us, and we look forward to, tomorrow we are going to have Commander McMillan on. We're going to Haven't decided yet whether it's going to be downtime and we're just going to shoot the shit, our little fireside chats, or if we're going to, I'm hoping it's going to be that. It's been a little while. And then on Friday, we're going to have Operator Starsky back at 1 p.m. Eastern. He is an officer in the Ukrainian National Guard. He was at the front lines. The command moved him back because he's got communication skills, and we have been the beneficiary of being able to speak with someone who is in the military in Ukraine right now. We will be seeing him on Friday, 1 p.m., to talk to him about what's been going on in the war. So I hope you guys will join us for that. And until then, thank you again. Please do check out Homozygoat, and we will see you all tomorrow.